They were never supposed to become a symbol. The Whittakers were just a family living quietly in the hills, surviving the way they always had. But once the cameras arrived, once the world decided to watch, everything changed. What began as compassion turned into exposure. What started as help slowly unraveled the very system that had kept them alive. For decades, the Whittakers lived on the margins, relying on a fragile but dependable safety net. Supplemental security income, Medicaid, food assistance. It wasn't abundance, but it was stability. It meant food on the table, prescriptions filled, and just enough money to make it from one month to the next. That system didn't make life easy, but it made life possible. Then the videos went viral. People were shocked by what they saw. A family living without modern comforts. A house in disrepair. Lives shaped by poverty and disability. Viewers felt something powerful. Empathy mixed with urgency. They wanted to help immediately. And help, in the internet age, usually means money. Donations poured in. Cash apps, GoFundMe pages, mailed packages, gift cards, appliances, clothing. Strangers promised to rebuild homes, fix lives, and give the Whittakers everything they had been denied. From the outside, it looked like a miracle unfolding in real time. Inside the family's world, it felt very different. Every dollar mattered, not just because it helped, but because it threatened everything. Welfare programs don't measure intention. They measure assets, income, property, bank balances. The moment money enters the wrong account, the system reacts. Benefits are paused. Reviews are triggered. Eligibility is questioned. The Whittakers didn't fully understand that at first. They had never dealt with large sums of money. They didn't have lawyers, financial advisors, or caseworkers guiding every decision. They only knew people were sending help, and refusing it felt wrong. Accepting it felt dangerous. SSI is designed to support people who cannot earn steady income due to disability. It comes with strict limits. Own too much, receive too much, save too much, and the system assumes you no longer need help. It doesn't care whether the money will last. It doesn't care whether it was meant for repairs or emergencies. It only sees numbers. As donations increased, the risk increased with them. Medicaid eligibility is tied to those same rules. Lose SSI, and medical coverage often disappears with it. For a family dependent on medication, doctor visits, and emergency care, that loss is devastating. One hospital visit without coverage can erase years of survival. Viewers rarely see this side of charity. They see generosity. They see hope. They see progress. But they don't see the letters from government offices, the reviews, the quiet fear that comes with every deposit, every gift card, every envelope of cash. Some supporters try to be careful. Funds were held by third parties. Accounts were kept separate. But the attention itself triggered scrutiny. Once a family becomes publicly associated with donations, welfare agencies notice. Reviews happen. Questions are asked. The system was never designed for viral charity. The Whittakers didn't ask to be rescued. They didn't ask to be restructured. They didn't ask to have their lives optimized by strangers. They were surviving in a way that worked for them, even if it looked broken to outsiders. Poverty is not chaos to the people living inside it. It is routine. It is structure. It is knowing exactly how much you can spend without losing everything. It is planning around scarcity with precision. When donations disrupted that balance, survival became harder, not easier. A new appliance meant higher electric bills. A car meant insurance, gas repairs. Cash meant benefit reviews. Gifts meant explanations. Every improvement came with a cost that wasn't obvious to the people giving. The Whittakers began to face choices no one should have to make. Accept help and risk losing medical care. decline help, and disappoint people who believe they were saving them. Try to explain systems that even professionals struggle to navigate. Meanwhile, online narratives grew louder. People argued about who was helping correctly, who was exploiting whom, who deserved praise or blame. The family became secondary to the story. Behind the scenes, the welfare support that once quietly sustained them began to slip. Reviews turned into suspensions. Paperwork piled up. Appointments were missed. Stress mounted. Charity had become a spotlight, and the spotlight burned. What many donors never realized is that welfare isn't generosity. It's infrastructure. It's designed to be boring, predictable, and slow. Viral charity is the opposite. It's emotional, fast, and public. Those two systems do not work well together. The Whittakers were caught between them. They didn't have the power to redesign the rules. They didn't have the language to push back. They didn't have the energy to fight on multiple fronts. All they knew was that life was getting harder, not easier, the more help arrived. This is where charity went wrong. Not because people were cruel, not because they didn't care, but because caring without understanding can cause harm. Because helping without context can destabilize lives. Because poverty is not solved with money alone. The Whittakers didn't need saving. They needed protection. They needed guidance. They needed support that worked within the systems they depended on, not against them. Instead, donations triggered scrutiny. Scrutiny triggered intervention. Intervention triggered loss. And loss triggered chaos. The safety net that had held for decades began to fray under the weight of attention. And once welfare aid is gone, it is not easily restored. The irony is painful. The very thing people believed would lift the family out of hardship may have pushed them deeper into it. Not because help is bad, but because unstructured help in a rigid system creates unintended consequences. This is not a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about systems colliding, about good intentions meeting unforgiving rules, about a family that survived quietly for years, only to struggle once the world decided to intervene. And this is only the beginning, because once welfare aid is disrupted, everything else follows. Housing, medical care, stability. If you've been following this story, or if this raises questions you've never considered before, share your thoughts below. Do you think charity helps more than it harms in cases like this? Or does the system make good intentions dangerous? As the donations continued, the consequences became impossible to ignore. What outsiders saw as momentum felt inside the Whittaker household, like pressure closing in from every direction. Every envelope, every online transfer, every public promise carried an invisible weight. It wasn't just money anymore. It was surveillance. The welfare system does not operate on trust. It operates on verification. Once a household appears to receive outside income, flags are raised automatically. Reviews begin quietly. Letters arrive with language that feels cold and unfamiliar. Requests for documentation pile up. Miss one deadline, misunderstand one form, and benefits can be suspended without warning. For the Whittakers, this wasn't just paperwork. It was survival. Betty had spent years learning the rhythm of the system. She knew when checks arrived. She knew how far food stamps would stretch. She knew which clinic accepted Medicaid and which prescriptions could be delayed if money was tight. That knowledge wasn't written down anywhere. It was lived experience, hard-earned over decades. The sudden influx of charity disrupted that rhythm completely. Donors assumed that once money arrived, government assistance would no longer be needed. But that assumption ignores reality. SSI payments don't magically turn into long-term security. A few $1,000s, even tens of thousands, disappears quickly when you're dealing with medical needs, home repairs, and daily living costs. And once benefits are lost, Getting them back can take months or years. The system does not pause out of compassion. One of the cruelest aspects of welfare policy is how it treats temporary help as permanent change. The moment a family appears to have resources, the system recalculates. It assumes independence. It assumes stability. It does not ask whether the money is ongoing, whether it will last, or whether it replaces the safety net entirely. That gap between assumption and reality is where harm happens. As reviews intensified, stress inside the Whittaker home grew heavier. Conversations that once focused on daily routines now revolved around fear. What happens if Medicaid stops? What happens if SSI is cut? What happens if food assistance disappears before the next donation comes? Or after the internet moves on? Those questions had no easy answers. The family did not have legal advocates explaining their options. They didn't have social workers guiding them through asset limits. They didn't have financial planners setting up special needs trusts or structured assistance. What they had was confusion, pressure, and a growing sense that accepting help had put them in danger. Online, the narrative was very different. Viewers celebrated milestones. A new appliance, a repaired porch, groceries delivered. Each moment was framed as progress, proof that generosity was working. Few people asked whether those changes were sustainable. Fewer still asked how they interacted with welfare eligibility. When some supporters raised concerns, they were often dismissed. They're better off now, people said. They don't need government help anymore. That belief, while comforting, ignored the realities of disability and long-term poverty. Government assistance wasn't a bonus for the Whittakers. It was the foundation. Without it, every other improvement became fragile. The situation grew more complicated as multiple people claimed to help manage donations. Funds moved through different hands, different accounts, different platforms. Even when intentions were good, the lack of coordination created risk. Money that couldn't be clearly explained became suspicious. Assets that couldn't be clearly categorized became liabilities. The welfare system does not care about good intentions. It cares about compliance. As scrutiny increased, so did intervention. Home conditions were re-examined. Living arrangements were questioned. Family dynamics were analyzed through a bureaucratic lens. What had once been private survival became a public case file. At that point, charity was no longer just about money. It had opened the door to oversight. The irony is that many of the issues flagged by authorities had existed for years. Living conditions had not suddenly worsened. Care routines had not abruptly changed. What changed was visibility. Once the family became a public story tied to large sums of money, the system took a closer look. And once the system looks, it rarely looks away. For families like the Whittakers, scrutiny is not neutral. It is disruptive. It introduces power dynamics they cannot control. Decisions are made far away by people who do not know their history, their relationships, or their coping mechanisms. Suddenly, the same home that had been deemed acceptable for decades was labeled unsafe. The same care arrangements that had gone unquestioned were reframed as neglect. The same survival strategies that once kept the family together were now cited as reasons for separation. Charity didn't cause these judgments on its own, but it accelerated them. The public nature of the donations made everything louder. Every disagreement became content. Every setback became evidence. The family struggles were no longer theirs alone. They were debated, dissected, and judged by thousands of strangers. That kind of attention doesn't just exhaust people. It erodes trust. Betty began to withdraw, not because she didn't appreciate help, but because she no longer felt safe. Every visitor could be another report. Every camera could be another trigger. Every conversation could be misinterpreted. The kindness that once felt comforting now felt invasive. This is where charity crosses a dangerous line. When help becomes conditional on visibility. When support requires access. When generosity demands a story in return. The Whittakers never agreed to trade their safety net for public sympathy. But once donations went viral, that trade happened anyway. As welfare aid weakened, the family faced impossible choices. Accept more help to cover lost benefits, which would only deepen scrutiny, or step back entirely and try to restore eligibility, a process that can take months without income or medical coverage. Neither option offered stability. Meanwhile, donors grew frustrated. They wanted results. They wanted transformation. When progress slowed, some accused the family of ingratitude. Others accused intermediaries of misuse. Trust fractured on all sides. What no one could undo was the damage already done. The welfare system had been disrupted. The family's equilibrium was gone, and restoring it would not be quick or easy. This is the part of the story that rarely goes viral. The slow collapse, the paperwork, the waiting, the quiet fear that sets in after the cameras leave. Charity is often measured by how much is given, but its true impact is measured by what remains afterward. In the Whittakers' case, what remained was uncertainty. Their story exposes a harsh truth. Helping without understanding systems can dismantle them. Giving without structure can destabilize lives. And attention, no matter how compassionate, can trigger consequences no one intended. The welfare aid that once sustained the Whittakers wasn't taken lightly. It was eroded step by step under the weight of visibility and misunderstanding. And once that safety net phrase, recovery is never guaranteed. This wasn't charity lifting a family out of poverty. It was charity colliding with a system that punishes sudden change. In the next part, the consequences move beyond paperwork and benefits. Because when stability disappears, families don't just lose income. They risk losing each other. Share your thoughts below. Should donors be responsible for understanding the systems their help affects? Or does the blame fall elsewhere when charity leads to harm? As the welfare support unraveled, the effects reached far beyond lost checks and suspended benefits. What followed was something far more devastating: instability. When the systems that quietly held the Whittakers together began to crack, the family itself became vulnerable in ways no donation could fix. The first signs came subtly. Appointments were missed. Mail went unopened. Phone calls from agencies went unanswered, not out of defiance, but confusion. The language of bureaucracy is difficult even for those with education and resources. For the Whittakers, it was overwhelming. Letters arrived filled with deadlines, warnings, and instructions that contradicted one another. Respond by this date. Submit this form. Prove this income. Explain this deposit. Every letter felt like a test they didn't know how to pass. Betty tried to keep order the only way she knew how, by sticking to routine. Meals at the same times. The radio on low. The house cleaned as best she could manage. But anxiety crept in anyway. She slept less. She worried more. The fear wasn't abstract. It was specific. Losing Medicaid meant no doctor visits. Losing SSI meant no utilities. Losing food assistance meant rationing meals. And looming over all of it was a question she barely allowed herself to voice. What if they take them? That fear had always existed in the background of their lives. Families living in poverty with disabilities know that visibility can be dangerous. But now the spotlight was bright, and the scrutiny relentless. Once the welfare system flagged the household, other agencies followed. Home visits increased. Assessments multiplied. Each one framed as concern, but experienced as judgment. The Whittakers were no longer just a family struggling to survive. They were a case. With each visit, the standards seemed to change. What had been acceptable before was suddenly inadequate. Clean wasn't clean enough. Safe wasn't safe enough. Care wasn't documented properly. The family didn't understand why the rules kept shifting, only that they were always one step behind them. The donations that had once promised hope now became evidence. Evidence of income, evidence of assets, evidence of instability. The same generosity that drew sympathy online raised suspicion within the system. At some point, the question stopped being about money altogether. It became about capacity. Could Betty manage the household? Could the family members care for themselves adequately? Were they being supervised properly? Were their needs being met according to standards defined far from the hills they lived in? These questions were not asked with cruelty, but they were answered with consequences. When the first removal happened, it wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no shouting, just a quiet decision communicated in official language. Temporary placement. For safety. For evaluation. For care. Temporary is a word that sounds gentle until it stretches into months. The separation fractured the family in ways no one was prepared for. Routine collapsed. Familiar voices were gone. The house felt emptier, not just physically, but emotionally. Betty moved through rooms she had cleaned for years and felt like a guest in her own home. The internet reacted swiftly and predictably. Shock turned into blame. Some blamed the state. Others blamed the donors. Others blamed the family themselves. Everyone had an opinion, and none of it helped. What was rarely discussed was how quickly things escalated once welfare aid destabilized. Without benefits, the margin for error disappeared. A missed appointment that once would have been rescheduled became noncompliance. A delayed response became a red flag. A misunderstanding became justification. The system does not see context. It sees patterns. Once a family enters that phase, it becomes very difficult to reverse course. Every action is documented. Every choice is scrutinized. Every attempt to fix things is measured against criteria the family did not help create. Charity did not directly cause the separation, but it set the stage for it. The influx of money triggered reviews. Reviews led to oversight. Oversight led to intervention. And intervention led to separation. This is the chain reaction that rarely appears in donation appeals or viral videos. The unintended consequences unfold quietly behind closed doors, long after public attention fades. For the Whittakers, the loss wasn't just emotional. It was practical. With fewer people in the home, benefits were recalculated. Those who had donated watched from afar, often unaware of how their involvement had altered the family's trajectory. Some expressed regret. Others doubled down, insisting they had done the right thing. A few disappeared entirely, moving on to the next cause, the next story. The family remained, separated, scrutinized, and struggling to navigate a system that now viewed them as unstable. The hardest part was the silence. Once agencies became involved, information dried up. Privacy rules kicked in. Updates stopped. The same people who had once shared every detail now could share nothing at all. Speculation filled the void. Rumors spread. Accusations multiplied. But the truth was simpler and sadder. The family was caught in a system that moves slowly and rarely admits error. Reunification, once taken for granted, became conditional. Classes, evaluations, demonstrations of compliance, proof of improvement. Improvement according to whose definition? For a family that had survived decades with limited resources, the sudden expectation to meet external standards without support felt impossible. The charity that had promised a better life had not prepared them for this moment. There were no lawyers explaining their rights, no advocates translating requirements into plain language. No professionals setting up protections like special needs trusts or structured benefits management. There have been money, but not infrastructure. That distinction matters because money can be spent. Infrastructure protects. Without it, the Whittakers faced a future shaped not by their choices, but by systems reacting to disruption. Every decision made on their behalf chipped away at their autonomy. The tragedy is that many of these outcomes were preventable. With proper planning, donations could have been structured to preserve benefits. Trusts could have been established. Advocacy could have been arranged before scrutiny intensified. But charity moves faster than systems, and viral attention moves faster than caution. The Whittaker story at this stage stopped being about help and started being about loss. Loss of privacy, loss of stability, loss of togetherness. The family did not fail charity. Charity failed to understand the family. As the months passed, the separation normalized in the eyes of the system. Temporary placements became longer. Reviews became routine. The urgency faded. What remained was a fractured household trying to find its way back to equilibrium without the safety net it once had. This is the cost that rarely gets counted. Not in dollars, but in years. Years spent navigating paperwork. Years spent waiting for decisions. Years spent apart. In the next part, the focus shifts to accountability. Who bears responsibility when good intentions lead to harm? And what lessons, if any, can be learned before the same mistakes are repeated with another family? The story doesn't end here. But by this point, the damage is already done. By the time the full consequences became clear, there was no single moment to point to as the breaking point. No dramatic collapse. No one decision that sealed the Whittakers' fate. Instead, it was the accumulation of choices made by outsiders, institutions, and systems that were never designed to work together. Charity collided with bureaucracy, and the family was caught in between. Accountability became the most uncomfortable question of all. Some donors asked it quietly. Others demanded answers publicly. Where did the money go? Who controlled it? Who was responsible for making sure the family didn't lose their benefits? These questions echoed across comment sections, forums, and private messages. But the truth was that accountability had been diffused so widely that it belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. The donors believed they were helping. The content creators believed they were advocating. The agencies believed they were protecting. And yet the outcome told a different story. No single person set out to dismantle the Whittakers' welfare support. But no one took full responsibility for protecting it either. The systems that governed SSI, Medicaid, and food assistance were rigid by design. They did exactly what they were programmed to do when financial irregularities appeared. They did not consider intent. They did not weigh emotional context. They did not factor in viral attention or public sympathy. They saw numbers. And once those numbers crossed certain thresholds, the response was automatic. The people closest to the situation often lacked the expertise to intervene effectively. Managing benefits for disabled adults requires specialized knowledge. It requires attorneys, case managers, social workers trained in asset protection. None of that was in place when the donations started flowing. There were cameras, yes. There was compassion. There was outrage. But there was no infrastructure. That absence mattered. As scrutiny increased, the Whittakers were expected to adapt quickly to expectations they did not fully understand. Forms had to be completed correctly. Appointments had to be kept on time. Documentation had to be perfect. The margin for error was razor thin, and mistakes were interpreted as negligence rather than confusion. This is where the system reveals its harshest truth. Vulnerable families are expected to navigate complexity without guidance. And when they fail, the failure is used as justification for intervention. The Whittakers were not given a roadmap. They were given deadlines. The longer the process dragged on, the more normalized the separation became. Temporary placements turned into routine arrangements. Evaluations replaced family visits. Progress was measured in compliance rather than well-being. The question shifted again. Not, how do we help this family stay together? But, can this family meet the criteria we've established? Those are very different questions. For Betty, the emotional toll was profound. She lived with constant uncertainty, unsure of what was required of her next. Every phone call carried dread. Every letter felt like a verdict. She worried not just about reunification, but about survival. Without full benefits restored, daily life became harder. Bills piled up. Food stretched thinner. Medical needs were postponed. The irony was painful. Help had arrived in abundance, and yet stability had never felt further away. As time passed, public interest waned. The story that once drew millions of views became old news. New crises captured attention. New families became the focus of sympathy. The Whittakers slipped back into relative obscurity, but now with fewer protections than before. This is another uncomfortable reality of viral charity. Attention is temporary. Systems are permanent. When the cameras leave, families are left to face the aftermath alone. Some donors expressed regret, acknowledging they hadn't understood the consequences of direct giving. Others felt defensive, insisting that responsibility lay elsewhere. A few tried to help retroactively, offering legal advice or structured assistance. But by then, much of the damage had already been done. Once benefits are suspended or terminated, reinstatement is slow. Appeals take months. Reviews drag on. During that time, families exist in limbo, surviving on fragments of what they once had. The Whittaker story became a cautionary tale whispered in advocacy circles. Not because people shouldn't give, but because giving without strategy can destabilize the very lives it aims to improve. True help requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires listening more than acting. Most importantly, it requires respect for the systems that vulnerable families rely on, even when those systems are deeply flawed. The lesson here is not that charity is bad. It's that charity without coordination, expertise, and accountability can be dangerous, especially when the recipients are people whose survival depends on carefully balanced benefits. There is a painful paradox at the heart of this story. The Whittakers became more visible than ever, and that visibility made them less safe. The attention that was supposed to protect them instead exposed them to scrutiny they could not withstand. In the end, no one walked away feeling victorious. Donors felt misled. Creators felt attacked. Agencies felt justified. And the family felt broken apart. What remains is a question that lingers long after the headlines fade. How many other families are one viral moment away from the same outcome? Because the systems that failed the Whittakers are still in place. The rules governing welfare eligibility have not changed. The gap between generosity and understanding still exists. And the temptation to fix poverty with money alone remains strong. If there is any responsibility left to take, it lies with all of us who watch these stories unfold. Responsibility to learn, to question, to slow down, to recognize that helping vulnerable families requires more than compassion. It requires knowledge, humility, and long-term commitment. The Whittakers did not ask to become a lesson. They did not consent to be a case study in unintended consequences. But their experience offers something valuable if we are willing to see it honestly. Helping is not about control. It is not about visibility. It is not about feeling good. Helping is about protecting stability first and improving conditions second. When that order is reversed, harm follows. The Whittaker family's welfare aid did not end because people didn't care. It ended because care was expressed without understanding the fragile systems that sustained them. And once those systems collapsed, rebuilding became infinitely harder than anyone imagined. The story doesn't end neatly. There is no clear resolution, no final victory, no simple villain. Just a family still navigating the aftermath of generosity that moved faster than wisdom. If there's one thing this story demands, it is reflection. Comment below. Do you think donations should be more tightly regulated when vulnerable families are involved, or does responsibility lie elsewhere? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.